Before the blade ever touched her neck, the fate of the woman France had come to despise was already sealed. Her execution was never meant to be a simple ending. It was designed as a spectacle, a punishment that reached far beyond death. The revolution wanted to break not just her body, but the very memory of who she had been. Marie Antoinette, once the radiant Archduchess of Austria, who filled the glittering halls of Versailles with music and laughter, now stood alone in the darkest corner of France. The journey from queen to prisoner had been slow and merciless, a stripping away of everything she once was. If real history grips you, history where innocence is crushed in silence long before the rest of the world realizes, then stay with me. Because her execution was not the real tragedy. What came before it was far more devastating. It began in the early hours of August 2nd, 1793. Paris lay under a heavy, breathless stillness, the kind that comes before a storm. Without warning, guards burst into the Temple prison. They didn't knock. They didn't hesitate. They went directly to Marie Antoinette's chambers. She clutched her children in terror, begging, pleading, knowing already that her words meant nothing. Her young son, Louis Charles, only 8 years old, screamed as they tore him from her arms. She threw herself over him. He is only a child. But her cries vanished beneath the shouts of soldiers. The little prince was dragged into the darkness, and she never saw him again. That final scream, small and terrified, followed her all the way to the end. She was taken to the Conciergerie, a prison so infamous that Parisians called it the Antechamber of death. Inside those walls, hope rarely lasted longer than a few breaths. A pile of straw served as a bed. A single candle gave her the illusion of warmth. 2 guards watched her constantly, day and night. She dressed under their eyes. She slept under their eyes. Even her most private moments were observed, recorded, judged. The purpose wasn't just surveillance. It was humiliation, carefully crafted to remind her with every breath that to the new France, she was no longer a queen, no longer a wife, not even a mother. She was just a body waiting to be processed by the guillotine. Yet the one thing they could not strip away was the memory of her children. Hidden beneath her corset, she kept a small portrait of her son and a lock of his hair tucked close to her heart. When her fingers brushed against it, her whole expression changed. Her breath slowed. Her eyes softened. Whatever remained of her strength lived in that tiny relic. Her only real human comfort in that cell was Rosalie Lamorlière, a young servant whose kindness slipped through the cracks of cruelty. Rosalie later said that the queen never wept for herself. Her tears appeared only when she whispered the names of her children, repeating them like a prayer, as if saying them might keep their faces from fading in the dark. Days blurred into one another. The light that filtered through the tiny window barely changed. Nights dragged on endlessly. Outside, the city roared and argued about liberty, equality, and justice. But inside her cell, those words sounded hollow. For her, time was measured not by clocks, but by the sound of footsteps in the corridor and the muffled cries of other prisoners being led away. Every time the door opened for someone else, she wondered if they would ever come back. Yet something unexpected began to grow inside her, a quiet, unshakable composure. The insults thrown at her became distant noise. The cruel laughter of guards no longer reached her spirit. She learned to move slowly, to speak softly, to save her strength. There was nothing left to cling to except her dignity. They expected a shattered woman, a hysterical queen begging for mercy. What they found instead was someone who had already confronted the worst loss a mother could endure. and was now facing the rest with a kind of exhausted courage. Once she had been accused of saying, "Let them eat cake." Now, in the darkness of the Conciergerie, no one imagined her saying anything at all. Silence became her final language. 76 days passed before her cell door opened again. This time, not for food or mockery. This time for judgment. The Revolutionary Tribunal resembled a crowded theater more than a court of law. People fought for seats. Vendors sold pamphlets filled with exaggerated stories about her supposed crimes and scandals. Spectators craned their necks just to watch her walk in, hungry to see the fallen queen with their own eyes. She wore the plain black dress she had used to mourn her husband, King Louis XVI. There were no jewels, no crown, not even a proper veil. Her once carefully styled hair was dull and loosely tied back. She looked older than her years, but there was a steadiness in her eyes that made it hard to look away. The trial was not about truth. It was a performance, crafted to feed the revolution's anger. The prosecutor hurled accusations with theatrical rage: treason, conspiracy, draining the nation's wealth, plotting with foreign enemies, rejoicing in the blood of the French people. Every sentence was met with cheers, jeers, and fists pounding on wooden benches. Most of the witnesses came armed not with facts but with rumors. They repeated stories lifted straight from satirical cartoons and hate-filled pamphlets, tales of lavish feasts while the poor starved, heartless laughter at the suffering of the people, cruel comments she had never uttered. To many in the crowd, none of that mattered. They did not come to hear her defend herself. They came to watch her fall. Then came the accusation that froze the room: incest. They claimed she had violated her own son. Louis Charles, alone and terrified, had been pressured, manipulated, and coached into signing a confession he could not possibly understand. Even hardened revolutionaries shifted in their seats. A murmur rippled through the hall. There are lines that even hatred hesitates to cross, and this was one of them. Marie Antoinette rose slowly. She did not look at the judges or at the prosecutor. Instead, she turned toward the section of the gallery where the market women sat, the same women who had once marched through mud and rain all the way to Versailles, demanding bread for their children. In a voice steady and resonant, carrying farther than anyone expected, she said, "I appeal to all the mothers who are here. You cannot believe that I would be capable of such a crime." For a heartbeat, the room fell silent. The words hung in the air like a weight. A crack opened in the hatred. A moment of shared humanity pierced through the noise. Some of the women lowered their eyes. Others wiped away sudden tears. In that instant, the monstrous caricature of the foreign queen wavered, and a mother stood in her place. But the verdict had been decided long before she spoke. The tribunal was never meant to weigh guilt or innocence. It was meant to offer a sacrifice to the revolution. On October 16, 1793, at dawn, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Back in her cell that night, she did not scream. She did not collapse. She sat at the small wooden table where her candle burned low and asked for writing materials. With a trembling hand and astonishingly clear script, she wrote a final letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. Her words did not speak of revenge. She did not curse her enemies or dwell on the injustice of her trial. Instead, she wrote of forgiveness, of faith, of love. She begged that her daughter and son be raised with kindness, that they learn not to hate the people who had destroyed their family. She prayed for Louis Charles, acknowledging softly that any words he had spoken against her had been forced from him by fear and manipulation. She ended the letter by sending her soul to God and her heart to her children. Revolutionaries seized the letter and hid it away. Even her last message of love was treated as dangerous. It would remain buried in their archives for years before the world ever read it. At 6 in the morning, the guards returned. They told her she must change clothes for the execution. She asked quietly, almost politely, for privacy. They laughed in her face. In the eyes of the revolution, there were no queens, only condemned bodies. Behind a thin wooden screen, with guards still watching her shadow, she removed her mourning dress. They handed her a rough white gown, the color of penitence and death. Its fabric scratched her skin, so different from the silk and lace she had once known. Then the executioner approached with scissors. He hacked off her hair, not with care, but like a butcher cutting rope. Pale, weakened strands fell around her feet in clumps. She did not flinch. Her wrists were tied tightly, tighter than necessary, the rope biting into her skin. She asked only one question. Why? My husband was not bound. No one bothered to reply. Before she left the cell for the last time, she turned to Rosalie, who was struggling to hold back sobs. The queen, no longer a queen, just a woman about to die, placed her bound hands gently over Rosalie's and said, "Do not weep for me. I have suffered so much that death is not a punishment to me any more. I am no longer afraid." She stepped into the courtyard, where the open wooden cart waited. It was not a carriage draped in curtains as her husband had received. It was a rough wagon used for criminals, its boards stained by mud and the traces of those who had ridden it before her. When she climbed aboard, she lifted her face toward the cold October sky and whispered words only those closest to her heard. "Now my peace begins." The journey through Paris lasted over an hour. The streets, once lined with people eager to watch her carriage pass in splendor, were now packed with onlookers who had come to see her final fall. Thousands lined the roads to scream insults, to spit, to throw stones and pieces of bread. Some laughed, some cursed, some simply stared, but she did not bow her head. She stood upright the entire way, her back straight, her bound hands resting in front of her, the wind tugging at her cropped hair and thin gown. Artists later wrote that her silence disturbed them more than her presence. It was not the silence of pride. It was the silence of someone who had already stepped, in her heart, beyond fear and humiliation. A silence that said, "You can control my body, but not the way I choose to face you." Jacques Louis. David, the painter of the Revolution, watched from a balcony as the cart rolled by. He opened his sketchbook and quickly captured her outline, the gentle tilt of her neck, the hollowness of her cheeks, the strange, almost supernatural calm in her profile. He meant to immortalize the downfall of a queen. Instead, he preserved the final courage of a woman. When the cart reached the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine towered above the crowd, glinting under the pale sky like a blade of frozen lightning. The uproar swelled. Drums rolled. Soldiers formed lines to hold back the pressing bodies of onlookers. She stepped down from the cart without waiting for help. She climbed the wooden steps, her movements slowed by the ropes around her wrists. At one point, she stumbled slightly and accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson. She paused, looked at him with genuine concern, and spoke her final words. "Forgive me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." No anger, no bitterness, no last-minute speech to sway the crowd, just a small human apology, almost gentle, whispered to the man preparing to end her life. It was so unexpected that even those close enough to hear it were momentarily stunned. Moments later, she was strapped to the plank. The blade rose. The crowd held its breath. The blade fell. The roar that followed shook the square. People shouted, "Vive la République! Long live the Republic!" Her head was shown to the crowd, then her body was placed in a simple cart and taken away, dumped into a mass grave in the Madeleine Cemetery. No coffin, no marker, no prayer. The woman who had once been the most visible figure in France disappeared into anonymous earth. But her story refused to die. France changed again. The revolution that had promised justice turned on itself. Those who had condemned her were themselves condemned, swallowed by the same blade they had worshipped. The guillotine devoured its creators, and the city grew tired of blood. In 1815, when the monarchy returned, the new king ordered a search for the remains of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. In a forgotten corner of the cemetery, buried among rubble, lime, and anonymous bones, 2 skeletons were found. One, with bound wrists and scraps of white cloth still clinging to it, was identified as hers. She was finally laid to rest with ceremony and dignity in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, among the kings and queens of France. History remembers her in extremes, either as a heartless villain of luxury or as a pure martyr of injustice. But the truth is far more human. She was a woman caught in the collapse of an old world and the birth of a new one. She made mistakes. She lived in privilege. She also suffered, lost everything, and faced her end with a composure few could match. And her final act, an apology whispered on the steps of death, became the ultimate proof that even when everything is taken away, dignity can survive. The blade took her life, but her humanity endured. Her story lingers wherever power, fear, and rumor collide. Whenever a crowd decides someone must pay for the pain of many, her last walk through Paris stands as a quiet mirror, asking whether hatred ever truly brings justice. If this story moved you, support the channel by subscribing and liking the video. Marie Antoinette has been judged for centuries, but rarely understood. Tell me, what will you remember her as?